The South African population grew to around 20% from 51.7 million in 2011. But can the economy keep up with this growth? Let's unpack this further with Wits Business School Professor Jannie Rossouw. A very good evening to you, Professor. Good to have your time. So a growing population. We're hearing that, in fact, access to basic services is also improving. But economically, is this population growth good news for South Africa?
Good evening, Temkile, and good evening to the viewers. In short, the population growth, according to the census, is 1.8% per annum or thereabouts. Our population growth over the last, our economic growth over the last decade has been about 1% per annum. So it is abundantly clear that on a per capita basis, South Africa is getting poorer. And the only solution for South Africa to resolve our economic problems, therefore, must be higher economic growth. So this government should start focusing on higher economic growth and should forget about all the ideological objectives. And
how do they take this data, Prof, and then flip it into actual solutions on the issue of economic growth? For example, when you look at jobs data, I mean, we've got some of the worst unemployment stats that we've had in this country, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, right? Yet there isn't an actual improvement. All we're hearing is everyone feigning shock and surprise and saying, well, something needs to be done, but the change never seems to come.
Well, this government should stop talking, for one. This government talks a lot and there's no action. Secondly, the government must accept that its current socialist policies are simply not working and should create scope for the private sector to get the economy growing so that we can get the much needed higher economic growth rate to create jobs for a growing South African population.
By that, do you mean cheaper labor, deregulation perhaps of the labor space?
I definitely mean deregulation. I definitely mean that the government should forget about the national health insurance scheme that the country can simply not afford. The government should forget about dreams that the country can simply not afford at this point in time. The government should create more scope for the private sector to get on with what the private sector does best, which is growing the economy and therefore creating jobs in the economy.
And ultimately then, we're looking at a burden of an unemployment rate that is stubborn. Many of the unemployed in this country are still young, previously disadvantaged people, black and mainly colored people who still sit without work, lower levels of education as well among that segment of the population reflected in the census. How do you make this an economy that works for those people specifically?
Well, indeed, it means that the government should look at the outcomes from the education system. South Africa, relative to its GDP, spends a high percentage of its tax income on education, but we get very poor results from our education spending. We get learners from the school system not equipped to enter the labour market. So there's clearly something wrong in the school system. So if the government wants to focus, it should be on the school system. Try to figure out a plan to get non-performing schools to the level of performing schools. Not what the government is doing at the moment with the BELA legislation, which is trying to get the performing schools down to the level of non-performing schools. So this government's whole focus is not on equal opportunities, but on equal low outcomes. We can no longer afford such an approach.
And on economic opportunities, Prof, I'm just trying to pull up the number, in fact, because I was looking at it yesterday. When you look at population growth, 15 million odd South Africans are based in Gauteng. We know that migration patterns domestically lead people here because this is the economic hub. If you're looking for work, you've got a better chance here than, say, in the Northern Cape, in fact, where there are fewer people as per the census. Is it even possible at this stage in this country to try and get a wider or better spread of economic opportunities to the other parts of the country?
Yes, we can look at successful provinces, like, for instance, the Western Cape is more successful than the Northern Cape or Limpopo province. Check what happens in the Western Cape and try and replicate that in the unsuccessful provinces. The other thing, of course, the important point from the census is it shows us the population spread through South Africa, and in due course that will have to be reflected in the way that the government distributes revenue from central government level to provincial government level. The census plays a very important role in decisions around such distribution of revenue amongst the provinces. And those provinces with more rapid population growth will get larger allocations.
Lastly, then, let me get your thoughts on the issue of migration once again. We learned yesterday that about 2.4 million international migrants are currently in South Africa at the moment. That makes up 3% of the population. When you consider the overall population size, a country of more than 62 million people with our socio-economic profile, is that unusual? Is it abnormal?
In my view, that's a bit low. We've heard about possible undercounting in the census. I, for one, was not counted in the census. So all I can say is I was undercounted. So there is undercounting. It seems to me that there's an undercounting of migrants. And this undercounting also shows us that it will get increasingly more difficult to do any census in South Africa, especially in an environment of distrust owing to crime, owing to corruption, owing to people being afraid to open their doors, to open their places where they live for people that they don't know. In an environment of crime, a census becomes increasingly difficult, and this is what we've seen in the last census in South Africa. So this government should also do something about our serious crime problem if it wants to be able to do any census in the future.
And the undercount rate, as I understand it at the moment from this latest 2022 census, is at around 31%, but Stats SA has approved this data, saying there were adjustments or provisions made to sort of even out, if you will, the accuracy in trying to understand overall trends in the country. But for a government faced with the many problems that South Africa is dealing with, and even business itself, because it'll have to look at this data and plan around it, how much of a challenge, shall we say, would the undercount pose to national planning?
Yeah, an undercount is always a problem for national planning because you use census data, for instance, to plan new schools to be built, to plan new hospitals to be built, and even to plan new old age homes to be built. So it's all over the demographic profile. So the government will have to think seriously about how it will do the next census in 10 years' time. It was difficult to do this census. It might be even more difficult to do the next census, and they will have to focus on ways to overcome the difficulties of this census in the next census that they do. But an undercount is always a major problem.
Good to speak to you, Wits Business School Professor Jannie Rossouw. Thank you so much for your time tonight.